Hey everyone, it's Emily. I'm back with Justin and Ripley, and today we're discussing how to start a vintage watch collection.
Also, if you haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can stay up to date on our latest video content.
Now before we get to this conversation, we've got to do a wrist check. So Ripley, it's good to see you. What have you got on your wrist today?
Yeah, good to see you guys too. I've got on my Speedmaster, and since we're talking vintage watches, playing up that vintage vibe is that mesh style bracelet, the Forstner Comfit. So what about you guys? What do you
Classic and beautiful. What do you got?
I'm going with another classic, not quite vintage, but a little bit older, something I love, the Kermit Submariner. I mean, you know me in green,
Yes.
Sport watches, any excuse to wear it, I will definitely take that opportunity, yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
Well, I went with my trusty Cartier Pasha. Nothing too special, but also pretty great watch.
Very unique.
Yep, very me, right?
And gold, yes, of course. Very Emily watch, yeah.
I know, guys. All right, so like we said, today we're discussing kind of the best way to kick off a vintage watch collection. Now, there's lots of different avenues that you can take kind of getting in this range, but we decided to break this up into a few different ranges, if you will. So we have two watches that we're gonna kind of present and get some feedback on from the 5,000 to 10,000 range. So I will start this one off. Obviously, I know we could go any route, but I decided to bring in this Lady-Datejust. Yes, it is gold, keeping it in true with my like. But you see this tiger's eye. This is just
Beautiful
under
dial.
10, just under 10K.
Yeah.
Really pretty.
Yeah, the 5 to 10 range is really interesting. There's not, it's a vintage Rolex, so slim pickings or kind of have to be rather selective under 5.
Yeah.
But between 5 and 10, it really opens the doors up. Datejusts are plentiful. You can get yourself a standard like 36 millimeter steel model for just over 5.6. But if you're getting something smaller, like if you were shopping for yourself, solid gold vintage Datejust tiger's eye dial, like that's kind of a lot of watch. That's sort of a serious flex for under 5 figures, so that's kind of impressive.
I felt like it was a good find.
It's a really good find. I mean, part of it is being a ladies' watch. You know, it's not quite as expensive as the men's, so you get a little more watch for your money. And like you said, this one's great. I mean, it ticks all the boxes. Solid gold. That tiger's eye dial is just gorgeous. It's definitely an eye-catcher, conversation starter. But like Ripley said, any Datejust, I think, is a great choice. I mean, I could choose any number of men's-sized Datejusts in that category that are, you know, pretty nice watches to start a vintage collection.
Yeah, I agree. Now, the one thing that kind of tipped me off to this one was the dial. You can clearly see in the 70s and 80s, correct me if I'm wrong, Rolex decided to kind of venture into sort of unique materials for their dials. So this existed around stone, wood,
coprolite, fossilized dinosaur dung, like all over the place. They did some really interesting stuff. And tiger's eye is kind of one of the more, you know, commonly seen and beautiful ones. Yeah, people, you see it, you know what it is. And I think it looks great with the gold, but it's sort of a fun thing to hunt and collect, because if you do vibe with that look and you want to kind of pursue stone and exotic material dials, great point of entry, and it's a whole rabbit hole into and of itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Just a DNA collection.
It is. So that's my pick. Hope you guys liked it. I'm excited to see what you brought, Justin.
I got something a little bit different. We're going into the sport realm, and for under 10,000, it's not a lot of Rolex, if any, that you're going to be able to come up with.
Yeah,
right?
Rolex sport watches, you're kind of
They're all
starting
north of that 10,000,
Yeah.
exactly. However, I do have a great option with the Tudor Submariner. And if you like the Submariner, you like the look, you like the style, you like the name, you're almost there. It's just the Tudor, which is Rolex's sister company. It has very closely the same look, right? I mean, markers are a little bit different, but a lot of it's the same. I mean, it even uses a lot of Rolex parts. There's the Rolex crown.
Yeah, I saw that.
If you see, back then they still used the Rolex signed crown.
Right? Yeah, there.
Yeah, right there.
Beautiful.
So it's you know, if you're looking for the Rolex Submariner and the price is just out of your range, I think this is a fantastic entry.
Yeah, if you want a 1680, but those start at 12, 15, 20, depending on how deep you want to get. This is literally the equivalent from Tudor, but it's not a carbon copy with a different name on the dial. You do get the same hallmark features, date at 3, plastic crystal, nice light kind of vintage feeling bracelet, but the hour markers, you get those triangles at the poles rather than the bricks like the sub. So it's a little bit different. It's inherently a Tudor, but at the same time, if you wanted a vintage sub and we're trying to keep it under 10, well, that's kind of the de facto choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that it's a little bit different. It's nice because it's the same. Again, if you're looking for that Submariner, this is, you know, a great option. It has the same, you know, classic Mercedes hands that you see on the Submariner.
That's one of my favorite details on
those details, but I like the markers being different. I like the triangle markers, and to me it's where say you end up getting a sub, maybe there's a different sub that you like down the road that's a little more expensive, you have the means or whatever, you don't necessarily have to get rid of this because they're too similar. I mean, when someone sees this, it looks like a Submariner, but almost instantly it looks like a Submariner. Oh, but wait, that's kind of different. Oh, it's a Tudor, and they're definitely less common.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent point. If you had this and then later bought a 1680 and you had the two in a collection, that'd be an awesome pair to compare and contrast.
Yeah.
So as getting your foot wet with a Rolex Tudor umbrella company sports watch, yeah, that's a logical place to start, and it's always going to have some room in your collection, no matter how crazy it gets.
Isn't that the point of building a collection? You kind of have your foundational pieces, which I feel like we're kind of covering sort of those options.
Yes.
But it's also, the point of it is to build on it. You know, it's a collection. It means add to it, right?
Yeah, and I'm definitely in that boat where I'm not buy one and then sell it and do a little better and then sell that and do a little better and kind of keep going. I like to buy a new one but never sell any of the old ones.
You're really about adding to it.
Yeah,
okay.
so I think it's great.
So that's our 5 to 10K range. It's important to note that our next range is 10 to 20K. So I'll kind of kick this one off. Staying true to the Emily factor, I do love gold. So I've got this gold Day-Date. Clearly you can see this beauty is an OysterQuartz.
Very cool watch.
Very great. It's got a lot of history about it. It's got a lot of history around it, I guess I should say, but it's also just sort of easily identifiable, and especially being able to kind of bring a Rolex into that vintage collection, this is kind of where I went.
Yeah. This one's nice. I personally love that it's quartz.
Yep.
I know that turns some people off.
I love it too.
I like quartz. I love the convenience. And Rolex, their quartz is kind of special, right? I mean, the way they did it was different. It didn't last that long. They didn't make that many of them, so it's actually, you know, kind of one of the more rarer watches out there, even though it doesn't get the attention. And then just everything about it, the whole look. I mean, it has that integrated bracelet look, and you know, it has the very angular case shape. So it's nice. It's Rolex, but it's a little outside the box, and it's something you don't see every day. I think it's a great choice.
Yeah, and even comparing it against other, I mean, as a Rolex, you're getting a solid gold Rolex Day-Date, so their flagship, that's a lot of watch for the money. It's solid 18 karat at under 20. But then among other Day-Dates, like you said, they did the OysterQuartz movements for a lot of years, but they didn't do that many of them. So when you compare this at under 20 to another Day-Date in 36 mil with an automatic movement like an 18238, 1803, this, in terms of uniqueness, it doesn't look like any of the others. It's a really special watch, and I'm sure at a certain point, I know people gravitate towards the mechanical movements, but I'm sure at a certain point, someone's going to wise up, and the prices aren't. This isn't going to be under 20 grand forever.
Yeah. So you can tell I like this watch. It sounds like you guys are a big fan of this watch, but I'm curious, what do you guys think? You've seen two of our options, this being the third, so like, let us know in the comments, like, if you like this watch, if you don't like this watch. It's always interesting to know what you guys think, even though we're the ones kind of sharing our thoughts.
And do you prefer this to the classic Day-Date President? Personally, I do, just because it's different, but I mean, the President's an
I really
icon,
like it.
so.
I find that this watch is kind of polarizing. I find people who are really into it, and then I find people who just don't like anything about it. They don't like the quartz or the shape of the case or the bracelet or whatever, but it seems kind of polarizing. So yeah, we're curious. Let us know what you think.
Yes. It's nice, too, because this is our collection that we're starting, so it's always important to note, what are you starting your collection with, or what did you start your collection with? So we'll get back into this range.
Well,
10 to 20, what'd you bring?
Add one in here. I'm going with another sport watch. GMT Root Beer. Beautiful watch, just to start off. I love this watch. I love the colorway. Just, I mean, it screams that time period. You know, you see it, and while it's not, you know, the most iconic, it's not like, you know, like the Pepsis or, you know, some of the other when you think GMT that you really think of, but I love it. I love the Jubilee bracelet, and it's just a really nice piece for, you know, under $20,000. It's the two-tone.
It's very wearable.
It's very wearable. It has the GMT complication, so it has some functionality to it. To me, this is something you can wear, you know, traveling out, like you can really do a lot with it, and it's not one that's, you know, a lot of vintage watches just kind of live in the safe, and this is one that, you know, I want on my wrist. So
I think it's worth mentioning that this isn't the original two-tone root beer. This is a 16713, so you're getting a sapphire crystal. It's a GMT 2. I believe this one's from the early 90s, and so for the person who's kind of shying away from like a really old vintage watch because they're worried about scratching the acrylic crystal, they want something a little bit more serviceable, but they still want something with a decidedly vintage aesthetic. This almost looks like something straight out of the 1970s, but when you start looking at closer, it's a GMT 2, it's got a sapphire crystal, you got the jumping hour hand, so it's really, really functional, but I mean, so nostalgic in terms of its overall appearance.
Absolutely, and it, being in that kind of transitional period, if you will, where, you know, it's not the original, but, you know, it's still vintage or, you know, it's in that borderline of that category, I think it has a lot of potential. You know, like right now it's under 20,000, but I could see that changing very, very quickly. I mean, especially with the looks of it, and as vintage watches, you know, just get hotter and hotter every year, I could see this one getting picked up pretty quick.
Especially because Rolex doesn't do a two-tone yellow gold GMT anymore. So if you want the new root beer, it's Ever Rose.
Sure.
And
which I also love.
I love that watch, but I know some people don't necessarily want the pink gold. You know, they kind of want the classic aesthetic. Maybe they want the brown dial. So these are kind of only getting harder to find because they don't have a contemporary equivalent. They have a very contemporary equivalent.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's a great pick at this price point as well. And if you don't want something classic, it's the sports watch, but still fairly resplendent with solid gold components.
Absolutely.
So true. All right, guys, so what are you doing? Are you adding this one to your collection, or are you passing on this one? Be sure to let us know in the comments. All right, so now we're kind of jumping to another range. This is now $20,000 to $50,000. So I've got this beautiful Submariner. Now this is a Tulipino dial. You can see the corona at the top is relatively reminiscent of a tulip. Lots of other functionality around this as well, but one of my favorites.
Yeah, I mean, once you're hitting 20 grand and you're getting a vintage Rolex, the big boys are coming out and you're getting some really interesting inside baseball, like nerdy stuff here.
Yeah,
so like
you can do a lot in this range.
You're getting a 5512 from the, like, I think 61 this one is, so you get the 4 lines of text, and that would have been an early version, and to represent that, it's the 2 different colors of printing, which kind of generally believe that they already had the dials. The 5512 originally didn't have 4 lines. So this would be an early example of it. I mean, there's a chapter ring. There's a lot to talk about on this one. This isn't your average sub, but you could get a vintage sub for cheaper, but if 20 to 50 is your budget, I mean, get something really special with a bunch of different talking points that you could have a whole collection of subs, and this one's still going to be kind of unique.
Yeah. And that's the range for, I mean, if you're looking for a vintage sub, which, I mean, let's be honest, if you're looking for vintage Rolex, that's probably on your list. This is the range where you can really do it proper, right? There's a lot of options in there. You're not limited to kind of just the most entry-level pieces. You can really get, I mean, with so many different iterations, different, you know, dials and reference numbers, that there's a ton. And I think this is a great one. I mean, quite honestly, there's a lot of different great vintage Submariners that fall in this range. This is just one example, and it's beautiful. I love it. I love the patina on this one. I just think it's a really clean watch. I'm a personal fan of no date. So I love the time-only dial, and yeah, I'd be very happy to wear this and add it to my collection.
I just felt like if I'm actually truly building out my vintage collection, I have to do the Submariner justice, and this felt right to me.
Yeah, you kind of need a vintage sub. Again, if it's collection, multiple pieces, unless you really just don't like the Submariner, it's sort of got to check the box.
It's a little obligatory.
Get the one you want, but if you want something a bit special, more special than, you know, that your average vintage sub, I
felt like this price range allowed us to kind of get to that point.
Yes.
So, as always, be sure to let us know, are you a fan of this one for starting out your vintage collection, or are you passing on to something else? And if you are passing on to something else, let us know what you're getting. But that's my pick in this range. Justin, what have you got in the 20 to 50?
I'm bringing something else.
Okay.
Something that I know Ripley is going to enjoy.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
And I thought my choice couldn't be overdone. You did it.
I love this one. I'm going to go with the first Rolex Explorer 2, the Steve McQueen. I love this watch. It's one of my favorite vintages. If I had to pin down a favorite, I don't think I could, but this is definitely on the short list, right?
Yeah, this kind of gets to it. What detail is your favorite at this point?
So I love that orange hand. I think I love orange. I love like the contrast of it. Plus, I just like the history about it. I like that you know it was the first Explorer 2, and you know how it's a GMT, but it doesn't really have the GMT function. There's just so much to love about this watch, and it's so iconic. You know, it's nicknamed the Steve McQueen, and it has a really unique look. I mean, they've done Explorers 2s since then, and haven't really done one that looked like that until very, very recently, and it doesn't even look that much like that.
And so for me, it's the dial. This is my all-time favorite Rolex. It's not as, you know, quote-unquote special or unique as the sub you just showed, but in terms of a lot of subs look kind of more or less like that. And it's until you get up close it starts to really, you know, show itself. This just doesn't look like any other Rolex. It's the only Explorer 2 to have this dial, only watch to have this dial. It's kind of a 24-hour watch rather than a, you know, a dual-time watch.
Right.
But like for me, that dial, it was criticized as being illegible when it was launched. But it's made for a 24-hour format, hence the fact that you can't set the hands differently for 2 time zones. But it's just so purpose-built. But like, come on, it looks like it's a Jetsons thing. And exactly, 1971 was when it was launched, Randall 84. There's a lot of them out there. They're all going to be matte dials, tons of variation among them. But what a cool watch. And if you like this aesthetic like I do, there's nothing else that looks like it.
Right.
So yeah, this would be my pick of them, all of them.
Yeah, this is unbelievable. Also the bezel.
And the only
love that
Explorer
bezel.
2 under 40 mil, only one with an acrylic crystal.
Yes.
The list of like kind of weird only quirks goes on and on.
Yeah.
So.
And it's nice, like we said, if you're building a collection, there's the Submariners and the Sea Dwellers, and the GMTs. You see the Pepsi 1675s and all these others. This one's different. I'd say this is one of the most different out of the Rolex vintage sport watches.
Yeah, you could literally buy another Explorer 2, and there wouldn't be that much overlap between the collections.
Yes.
You know, if it was a different reference, it would be distinct watches.
They will be much more different than the difference between a Submariner and a Sea Dweller at the same time. So yeah, exactly. I think it's great, and it's a great one to have in your collection.
Yeah. I was just saying, let us know, are you adding this one to your collection or not?
Yes. If
Ripley says yes.
I know I got Ripley on board.
If the
That's
needs
for
permit,
sure.
if there's a benefactor out there that wants to send me one, yes, firmly yes.
You know where to send it. But okay, so we have one range left. Now, this is a little bit different than what we have been doing. This is at our 50K plus. Now, Justin and I did agree on this choice together, so we have one watch to be presented.
We have one watch representing an entire category. Wow. Really, let's talk about Daytonas, right?
Yeah,
we're talking about over $50,000 vintage Rolexes. We're talking about Daytonas.
A category where the sky's the limit. Like literally, the sky's 17 like the sky's the limit.
Yes,
yeah.
and there's tons of options in there, right? We go everything from $50,000 up to 17 plus million. Yeah. So tons of different dial options, tons of different reference numbers. There's just so much, and the vintage Daytona is such an iconic watch, and it's just so reminiscent of vintage
and the
Rolex.
Entry price is so high.
Yes.
If we're talking about the first generation, so there's plenty of other vintage Rolex watches that exist above 50K, pre-crown guard subs, Bakelite GMTs, all of that stuff. Some crazy exotic day dates certainly, but you can get a vintage sub, as we've shown, for quite a bit cheaper. You can get a vintage GMT, as we've shown, for quite a bit cheaper. Vintage Daytonas are just expensive. If you want one of the original manually wound ones with an acrylic crystal, the cheapest you're getting isn't that much less than 50. All things considered, you're not grabbing one for 10, 20 grand, unless you're really lucky. So, I think it kind of makes sense to represent this category with one watch where it doesn't really have that many cheaper equivalents. Granted, the 6.2, 6.3's up there as far as vintage Daytona prices, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of the de facto choice if you're playing around with that budget.
And all those things, it just leads to that price, right? It's just they're expensive.
Buy a vintage Daytona, so it doesn't matter if you buy all these other watches. If you're collecting vintage and collecting vintage Rolex, all roads at some point lead to a vintage Daytona.
Yes.
Maybe it's a Paul Newman, maybe it's not, but like, if you check that box first, well, look at all the fun you can have and never spend as much.
Yeah, that's true. Everything's relative.
That's such a fun point. I love this watch. I think this is a great pick. It's also just kind of to the GMT that we brought in earlier point, very wearable, which I know don't come for me. I feel like I couldn't have this in my collection and not want to wear it on occasion at very least.
Cry when I smashed into a door frame. But yeah, it's
very carefully wear it, absolutely.
You're right, but though it's not quite as shiny and luxurious as the modern present day Daytonas, not having the crown guards being smaller than 40 mil, acrylic crystal, bit more stark dial. It looks a little more tooly, a little more casual. Yeah. And although you see these frequently worn with suits because it's a vintage Rolex Daytona, it's also a watch where you'd also see this killing like t-shirt and jeans.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
This one, to me, it really goes anywhere. I mean, t-shirt and jeans, you could wear it on a suit. It's like, I can't pick a day when I couldn't find an excuse to put it on my wrist. I love chronographs anyway. So, just the fact that it's got that vintage chronograph. I mean, there's plenty other nice ones out there, but Rolex is king and Daytona is king.
And it's kind of a safe buy. If you're getting your feet wet collecting vintage and you may not love the watch years down the line because you're just starting out, it's a vintage Rolex Daytona. You're not going to have a hard time getting rid of it. So the kind of the liquidity aspects there. So wherever your collection takes you, whether or not it even includes this watch, and if you're playing with this much money, it's not a bad one to buy in case your tastes ever change or you want to liquidate it to buy that next grail out there.
Right.
Very true. All right, so we've had a chance to kind of showcase what we would kickstart our vintage collection with. Now, it's come to that time of our conversation where no budget, which single watch are you adding to your vintage collection first? Justin, you can go first.
I'll go first. I will go with the Daytona.
Okay.
No budget, and I'm not purchasing it. Like I said, I love the Daytona. Rolex chronograph vintage is kind of king, and I'm just going all in. I'm going to start right there. I love it. I love the watch, and you know, I like everything about it. So
I like your
easy
pick.
choice for me.
That's good. What about you, buddy?
Yeah, I mean, if someone's giving it to me, I'd be hard to not pick the Daytona from a monetary standpoint. But like I've said, and I will die on this hill, 1655.
Love it.
The best looking Rolex, my favorite Rolex, and I would take that over the Daytona because I love that watch more than any other thing they've ever produced.
Yeah. This one's really hard for me. Honestly, I love both of these watches out here. The Daytona is unbelievable. This Explorer is just iconic, and for me, just a passion. Like, I love that watch so much. However, because you both have already chosen this, I feel obligated to pick something else. And I am not afraid to admit, I love this OysterQuartz.
Ah, that's good.
Polarize it all you want. This is my pick. She's a beauty.
We can't all pick steel sports watches,
No.
and I think that's a really good point to represent. Vintage Rolex is, I mean, steel sports watches garners a lot of the attention, but vintage Rolex is any older
So much
Rolex
bigger than that,
spans
yeah.
everything, including quirky quartz stuff. You know,
And I feel like you've kind of taken the words out of my mouth. I enjoy those unique pieces in my collection.
Right.
And so at this point, this just makes the most sense for mine. It fits, it works, it's still kind of that entry point to getting to my Steve McQueen or getting to my vintage Daytona at a later date. So
yeah, I'd be shocked if you didn't pick something gold too.
I was gonna say it's a very Emily watch, so yeah, it's very fitting.
Yep. So these are our picks, you guys. We've got to know, what are you kicking off your collection with when it comes to vintage watches? Are you going Rolex? Are you going a different brand? Are you going sport if you decide to go Rolex? Be sure to let us know in the comments. This was a really fun conversation, you guys. Thanks for bringing your picks, and thanks for
these are some great
validating with
watches.
some of the details.
Yeah.
I know. We'll definitely be back with another watch talk, but until then, you guys, be well.